Well, welcome everybody. Good morning. Thank you once again for being here on this blustery day as we go into week 5 of 7 on the social statements, and in this case, social message of the ELCA, talking about immigration. But as always, before we do get into our discussion, let's pray. For Lutheran Pastor David Lewis. Dear Lord, our lives are filled with ambiguity, and we don't always know the right or best thing to do. But we do know that your love is guiding us, and that you have called us to live as your people in the world. When we face hard choices, give us eyes to see the best path forward and the courage to follow it. When we make mistakes, forgive us. When we are hurt by our choices, comfort us. When we hurt others, help us to reach out to them in love. And above and beyond all these decisions, remind us that you still love us and call us back to this place, that we may be forgiven, renewed, called, and sent forth once more as your beloved children. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. One class note before we get started. I have received feedback from a few people that the discussion is lovely, but they would like us to get through the document. So I'm actually hoping, because I know there's going to be a lot of questions and conversations, that we can kind of get through these and then mark the place where the questions, where the comments, where they come up for you, and then we'll save that discussion for the latter part so that those who want to continue to converse can do so, and those who need to go can do so. Make sense? Okay, so just hold the thought. We will have a time for questions and comments, but we've got a lot to get through this morning, so we'll try and work our way through the documents and then have our discussions. So, the first document being, because the social message on immigration refers to some of these biblical passages, I just thought we might share, I won't go through all of these, but a couple biblical words on welcoming the stranger and what that word in the Greek and the Hebrew means. And we'll just focus on, of course, in Matthew, we hear that Jesus himself was an immigrant, a refugee. He had to flee because of religious political persecution. There's, of course, when Jesus spoke to the Samaritan woman at the well, the greatest commandment to love our neighbor, and as the parable of the Good Samaritan articulates, our neighbor is everyone we encounter. Love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. In Luke 14, Jesus talks about when you give a meal, he specifically says, don't invite your relatives or rich neighbors because they'll pay you back. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. Specific direction from Christ to welcome people, specifically who don't, what we might say, quote unquote, contribute, because that is the blessing. It is more blessed to give than receive. And then just drawing attention to Matthew 25, the parable, the well-known parable of the sheep and the goats, where the king separates the sheep and the goats and honors the sheep for their care of those in need and chastises the goats for their lack of care. And I just wanted to point, relative to this discussion, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. That word in the Greek Biblical Dictionary is xenos. It's the word from which we get, for example, xenophobia. It is stranger, strange, foreign, a stranger, a foreign, an alien. It is the opposite of citizen. So I was not a citizen. I was a foreigner, I was a stranger, I was an alien, and you welcomed me. And what you did to the least of these members of my family, you did to me. Couple admonitions from Paul: welcome the stranger, show hospitality. Hebrews 13, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that some have entertained angels without knowing it. Probably a reference back to Abraham showing hospitality to the 3 visitors, the Lord, in Genesis 18. And then a couple words of wisdom from the Old Testament. A lot of this from the Old Testament law, the commandments of God to the people. You shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien. And again, in the Hebrew lectionary, that is the word gur. A sojourner, an alien, a person who leaves their village and tribe because of war, famine, pestilence, blood guilt, etc., and seeks shelter and sojourn elsewhere. So, an alien, an immigrant, a migrant, a stranger, a foreigner. Do not oppress the immigrant. You know what it's like to be an immigrant because you were immigrants in the land of Egypt. Leviticus 19, the alien who resides with you shall be to you as a citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you are aliens in the land of Egypt. You shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Do no wrong or violence to the alien, the orphan, the widow, or shed innocent blood. The Lord's words of judgment in Malachi, judgment against those who thrust aside the alien and do not fear the Lord. And then Micah 6:8. He's told you what is good, to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly. So there's some scriptural foundation for the discussion to come as we go into a social message on immigration. Some of these are referred to in this document. I was a little confused when I was first going through it because it was in 98. And again, this is a social message, so this was not approved by the church-wide assembly. This was approved by the church council as a more immediate address of more immediate concerns in November of 1998. However, it does mention Amparo, and Amparo was not formed until 2014. And then I noticed that it was updated by the church council in 2018 to adjust dated titles and organizational references. So that's why this document, even though it's older, refers to Amparo, because they did update it in 2018. But I thought we might start in the back of the document. On page 11, there are some definitions that might be helpful before we dive in. Language matters, and how we speak to and about people matters. So asylum seekers arrive in the U.S. without legal protection, and they have to prove a credible fear of persecution, that they really will be in danger if they return. So they are seeking asylum, which is legal to come into this country to try and do. Immigrants are lawful permanent residents or naturalized citizens who have come from another country and legally live in the U.S. In common usage, it may refer to all newcomers who now live in the country. Lawful permanent residents are non-citizens who have received authorization to live permanently in the U.S. They receive a green card to prove their status. Newcomers without legal documents, people who come into the U.S. without valid visa or who have remained in the country after their temporary visa has expired, which is many of the people who are here without documentation are actually came in with a visa, and then that visa expired, and then they just stayed. Refugees, people who have a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. So a refugee are people who are forced to flee from their home country because if they don't, they will die or experience suffering and damage. So, some definitions before we dive into yes?
What's the difference between asylum seekers and refugees?
Well, refugees are my understanding is, anyone who just leaves and just needs to leave and is seeking shelter somewhere else. Asylum seekers are actually people who want to stay here and go through into the process to try and be granted asylum to stay. So asylum seekers will be refugees. Refugees might not necessarily be seeking asylum, if that makes sense, as I understand it. Yeah. It's a little bit of a distinction without much difference. I hear what you're saying, but yes. Okay, so the social message starts, so into the social message document itself on page 1. The ELCA recognizes and rejoices that our church, along with our country, continues to change with the steady arrival of newcomers into the U.S. At the bottom of that paragraph, we thank God for these developments, and we remember Paul's admonition, welcome one another, just as Christ has welcomed you to the glory of God. And again, Paul speaking to people who were nationally, racially, ethnically, religiously diverse. We also recognize the obstacles and differences our church and society face in welcoming newcomers. Too often we are slow in, tire of, or even resist fostering a hospitable environment for newcomers. Too often we perpetuate the racism, the fear of, and the animosity toward newcomers that show themselves in our society. Our country's history exhibits an ugly strain of exclusionary attitudes and policies towards newcomers who differ from the majority. Next paragraph, the presence of newcomers in our church and society heightens our awareness of these realities and of the experience of new immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers in the U.S. This awareness makes us more appreciative of the gifts our new neighbors bring and of the barriers as well as the opportunities they encounter. It deepens our belief that all people are God's creatures, sinners for whom Christ died, and our responsibility to respect the human dignity of all. Again, this is rooted in our faith in Christ, our Christian confessions, our belief in the triune God who is a relationship of love and who created every human being in God's image to love and serve and cherish each other, and so to treat all people, no matter who they are, no matter where they are, no matter where they come from, with dignity and respect. Given there are debates about immigration law, of course, and how we should do that, there is a fundamental call for Christians to be respectful, to be decent, to be compassionate toward all human beings. And they reference For Peace in God's World and Race, Ethnicity, and Culture, a couple of documents that we have already studied. Continues, this is a fitting time for us to examine anew our attitudes toward newcomers, to strengthen our church's ministry among, with, and for the most vulnerable of newcomers, and to continue to advocate for immigration, refugee, and asylum laws that are fair and generous. So then they move on to drawing on our own experience. This feels to me like a call for empathy. How would you feel? Or how have you felt? If you were in a place where you knew you and your children could be brutalized or killed, and by traveling so many miles to a place that projects itself and prides itself on being a place of safety and welcome and prosperity was just that close, would you go? Would you risk it? Would you not? What would that be like for you if you had a chance to list? I was thinking of, as maybe others of us are, the words of the Emma Lazarus poem, bring me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. That is a call for people who are in need to come to this country. The new Colossus, the Statue of Liberty, the mother of exiles. How do we who are residents learn to welcome newcomers more graciously? As members of a church with immigrants and with roots in immigrant churches in a nation of immigrants, again, unless there are any Native Americans among us, we have an immigrant history. We are familiar with old and new stories about newcomers. So think about our own. I shared last time about my mother's side of the family who immigrated from Germany at some point generations back and landed in Iowa, German Lutheran Iowans. And then next paragraph, recalling these stories may help those of us with families who have been in this country for a generation or more to empathize with today's newcomers. When a young immigrant woman is exploited by her employer, are we outraged? We would have been if that woman were our own mother or grandmother shortly after her arrival. When a beautiful array of people from around the world become citizens, do we rejoice? We would have when our own family became citizens. When leaders in our society promote negative stereotypes of newcomers or make them a scapegoat for social or economic ills in times of anxiety, are we appalled? We would have been to hear our own ethnic groups degraded when they first arrived. When we learn how our society is being strengthened and renewed by the contributions of newcomers, are we grateful? Earlier generations were grateful for the contributions of those who entered this country through Angel and Ellis Islands or Miami. Recalling that our families were once the stranger, And again, that's all of us, unless we're Native American. And remembering our Lord's call to love our neighbors as ourselves can expand our moral imagination, enable us to see the new stranger as our neighbor, and open us to welcome today's newcomers. Then it talks about that our church, the Lutheran Church, the bodies that became the ELCA, has a history of hospitality for refugees. Following World War II, when 1 out of every 6 Lutherans in the world was a refugee or displaced person, again, because of the history of Lutheranism in Germany and Germany following World War II, Lutherans, with the participation of 6,000 congregations, resettled some 57,000 refugees in the United States. And here I want to mention a couple of organizations if you want to learn more about what that looks like and what the ELCA has done and is currently doing. Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, lirs.org, lirs.org, has a ton of resources. And in the footnote in the document, it's a national agency of the ELCA, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and the Latvian Evangelical Lutheran Church that went back to 39 and that major resettlement after World War II and continues to work with people who are displaced and with refugees. And then also there is Amparo, that we'll talk a little bit more later, but that is accompanying minor migrants through advocacy and support and other resources. So, and if you go to elca.org, one of the subheadings is Amparo. It's mentioned later in the document as well. So there's a history of ELCA and its predecessor bodies working to help displaced persons find a new place, find a new home. A couple paragraphs down, the leaders and congregations that have given us this legacy remind us that hospitality for the uprooted is a way to live out the biblical call to love the neighbor in response to God's love in Jesus Christ. They recall for us God's command to Israel, which we read earlier. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as a citizen among you. You shall love the stranger as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. They direct us to where Jesus said he is present. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. The parable of the sheep and the goats. They call on Martin Luther to ask us, how do we know that the love of God dwells in us if we take upon ourselves the need of the neighbor? And again, the question the lawyer asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? And Jesus saying, well, your neighbor is the person who needs you. That's your neighbor. There's no geographical restriction to that. Our desire is to carry on their faith and practice their exemplary way of faith being active in love. Galatians 5:6. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself in love. We pledge to continue our church's historic leadership in caring for refugees and immigrants. So, how do we do that? I will pause here if there are any questions or comments about that first section. We've gotten in a chunk in ways. Okay. So how do we do that? Strengthening our ministry with the most vulnerable. The ELCA ministers with the most vulnerable of newcomers through congregations, the Amparo strategy, and Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services. When possible, we work ecumenically. Our ministry accompanies migrant children and families in the U.S. and abroad, resettles refugees, advocates on behalf of detained asylum seekers, offers pastoral and legal counsel to persons without legal status, aids persons with the citizenship process, and helps newcomers learn to live in a new country. Amparo is accompanying migrant minors with protection, advocacy, representation, and opportunity. And in Spanish, that word is, Amparo is protection of a living creature from suffering or damage. So that was why they sort of picked that acronym, because it's a word for protecting the vulnerable, protecting the living. It was founded in 2014, and it was founded in response to the children who were fleeing, unaccompanied minors, who were fleeing from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. With 70,000 unaccompanied children coming into this country. Which, how vulnerable. How vulnerable. You're in this new place, you don't speak the language. So I will share here during last synod, or was it first call? It was first call theological education. we went to an organization called Survivors of Torture. And what they do is they help people who have fled to this country because, and specifically who were tortured because of their religious or political beliefs in their home country. And they help them go through that process of applying to stay here as permanent residents. And they offer them shelter and language classes. And one thing that just struck me is, so they go to court and they ask for like their birth certificate. Do you even carry your birth certificate with you when you go on vacation? How on earth are you going to be carrying this documentation when you're fleeing from your country in the middle of the night because you're going to be killed? And yet here these courts expect you to be able to prove all this stuff when you're fleeing for your life. And I had never thought of that before. If I fled, how would I prove anything? So just the real vulnerability of people who are coming to this country. Who are seeking refuge, who have been victims, in that case, of torture and political and religious oppression. Or they're young, and they're young, they need help. So refugees are persons who have been forced to leave their country because of persecution or well-founded fear of persecution. Persons fleeing dangerous situations in their countries arrive daily in the U.S. These asylum seekers lack legal status for entering the country. To receive an opportunity to seek a grant of asylum, a legal protective status, they must provide a credible fear. And as I mentioned, because of the difficulty in proving this fear, many asylum seekers are detained while their case is being processed. Thousands of persons, including children and women, are in detention, most of whom are indigent. They are often isolated from pastoral and legal services and subject to abuse and neglect. Again, when you're that vulnerable, people are going to unfortunately take advantage. The ELCA's Amparo and LEARS join with other organizations to advocate on behalf of detained persons. In areas where are there detention centers, congregations are encouraged to work with those organizations to provide services for the detained and to seek alternatives to detention, for example, group homes. So a couple paragraphs down, newcomers without legal documents also are among the most vulnerable. Congregations are called to welcome all people, regardless of their legal status. Trust me, I appreciate how controversial this is. I get it, especially in our current context, in our world, literally right now. The very passionate disagreements about immigration and how we should treat people who are coming into our country. And yes, to be fair, for a variety of reasons, and in a variety of ways. But I remember at our Synod Council meeting, we did a border visit. And the senior pastor at St. Andrew's Church in San Diego, which is Bishop Andy Taylor's former church, his name is Manuel Redemosa, and he talked about the term illegal alien. And he said that was harmful because a person isn't illegal. A person isn't invalid. a person isn't a status. So to say someone is an illegal alien is, from his perspective and in his work, he works with border angels, those are the groups that put food and water in the desert so people don't die. Whether or not you agree if they should come or not, we probably should all agree that they shouldn't just be left to die. So he says that term, illegal alien, is a challenging term. It's a damaging term, which is why in this document, and you'll hear people say undocumented workers, people who are here without authorization. And that's true and fair. There are ways in which they're here without authorization. But he just said, that's a hard term. And it's often a term that's used in a weaponized way to the damage of people who really are vulnerable and really are here to seek a better life. Now, again, to be fair, are there people who are criminals who come across the border and who do criminal things? Yes. There are people who are citizens who are criminals and do criminal things. Yes, that's true too. Should we stop those people from doing those things? Of course. I don't think anybody would argue that we shouldn't. But I get it. I get this is a challenging and very controversial topic, but this is from the ELCA's perspective and from the things that I have heard and seen and learned as a person who's had conversations with people who are, for example, undocumented. And as I mentioned, I think a couple times ago, understanding all the complications. And the document will say later, we respect a country has the right to defend its borders, to have law and order. Yes, of course, you need law and order to have a civilized society. But we're also called to be people of hospitality and welcome and compassion. And how do we do that in a complicated world? Persons who once were or now are without documents are members of our congregations, and we want them to feel and know that in the church they are part of a safe and caring community. We encourage bishops and synods to show their support for congregations composed of or working with immigrants who may or may not have documents. Now, I just want to clarify something too that'll come up later. I think it does in this document. There's another document that was an update about immigration that the council, this church-wide council put together, and then in the sanctuary document statement, which you also have. None of this is asking anyone to break the law. So they make that clear. This is not asking people to intentionally break the law. It is asking people to question the justice of some of the laws that we have. But neither this document nor the sanctuary denomination declaration document in any way requires or even requests congregations to do things that they're not comfortable with in terms of legality, which is very ELCA. They leave a lot up to the congregations. So if our congregation wasn't comfortable, if we felt we were breaking the law in harboring someone with not legal status, that's not something the ELCA, oh, you have to do that. They wouldn't say that. They might encourage us to be compassionate, but the ELCA is very, I think, aware that there's a diversity of people and opinions in our congregations and trying to honor where we're all coming from. Any questions or comments about that? Okay. So we'll skip to, what else can we do? Advocating for fair and generous laws, that next heading. Immigration, refugee, and asylum policies express who we are as a nation, influence the nation's future character, and affect the lives of millions of people. We encourage our members, in light of our history and our ministry with newcomers, to join with other citizens in our democratic society to support just laws that serve the common good. Our advocacy needs to take into account the complexity of issues, the diversity of interests, and the partial or relative justice of laws. At the same time, it counters appeals rooted in hostility, racism, prejudice, indifference, and simplistic solutions. We draw on the best of our nation's traditions as a refuge and haven for the persecuted and destitute, when we affirm that we support a generous policy of welcome for refugees and immigrants, and that we will advocate for just immigration policies, including fairness in visa regulations and admitting and protecting refugees. We will work for policies that cause neither undue repercussions in immigrant communities nor bias against them. So, fair, just law, which again, how do we make that happen, of course, is up for much debate, but I think that is a goal that everyone would want. Laws that are fair and just and not discriminatory. So again, how do we do that? What are we advocating for? So here are some of the objectives set forth in the 69 statement, Lutheran Council in the United States, which is before even the ELCA, but the ELCA is affirming them in this message. To admit to our permanent population a steady proportion of newcomers by facilitating the reunification of families. Who doesn't want to be with their kids? Who doesn't want to be with their parents? That was something else Pastor Manuel said. He said, look, it's not, if you leave your kids to go try and make a living wage, that's not something you want to do. That's not an easy decision. That's a decision you make when you feel or you don't have any other choice. The The second, to admit annually a reasonable number of persons described above on an objective basis of selection, which, while discriminating, will not be discriminatory with respect to race, national origin, color, or religion, testifying thereby to the United States recognition of the interlocking and mutual interests of all nations with regard to the migration of peoples, the intersection of cultures, and respect of universal human rights. Again, I have heard people say that people should get in line. And my understanding is, from what I've learned and heard, is that in some cases there is no line. There is no way. There just isn't a line. And if there was, it's impossible to find. And it's extremely complicated to try and get and apply for, and difficult to get legal status, even for people who've been here for a long time and have been trying for a long time. And again, Pastor Manuel told a story about a friend who has someone who works for her, I believe from Mexico, had been here for a long time, has a particular skill working with horses, so this is a skilled person who would qualify under that. She was contributing money to help him stay. It cost thousands of dollars, and it took 12 years. No criminal record, just a hardworking person who'd been here, who had a job, who was contributing to society. It took several $1,000s and 12 years. That's a broken system. I mean, that's just, yes.
So there is no process to become a citizen?
There is, but you have to. So I almost brought this chart. Amparo has this chart. It's like a flow chart of citizenship and how you, unless you have family here, which is the main way people gain citizenship, or you have a very specialized skill or a lot of money, there really isn't. You're not going to get admitted. You're not going to get in the line. You're not going to get in the line. If you have those things, you're going to get in the line, but then the line can take anywhere from 6 to 12 years or more, depending on, okay, so you have a family member here. Well, is it your cousin? Probably not going to work. Is it your mom? Okay. Did you come in as a minor? The whole DACA debate, the whole Dreamers. Kids who are brought here, they've been here, they're going to college, so there are for some people, it's not going to happen because you don't have any of those things that would make it more likely to happen, but wouldn't even necessarily guarantee it. And again, this is my limited understanding. I would encourage all of you to do more research, to go to the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services and the Amparo websites. They're going to have a ton of information on this stuff. And these are people who've been working in this area for years, so they're going to know a lot more about it than I do. But from my understanding, it's very, very hard to become a citizen, even for people who've lived here, even for people who bring skill sets, even for people who have money. Of course, I guess if you have enough money, sadly in our world, but it's tough. Everything that I've heard from people who know and I trust, it's very difficult. And the idea of getting in line just isn't a thing, because either there isn't a line, or it's impossible to find, or it's 12 years long. Yeah. Thank you, good question. Okay, 3, to provide reasonable access to nationality and citizenship for all immigrants admitted for permanent residence. So you get here, you've got a green card, okay, help people become citizens, and again, remember, these are people who are doing it, quote unquote, the right way. They're here, they're working, they want to be part of this amazing country. And who can blame them? We have an amazing country. We should honor that. I think this document is saying we should honor that. We shouldn't make it so hard. Nowhere in here is anybody saying there should be no rules or qualifications or no work involved. That's not what this document is about. It's just saying it is so incredibly complicated and difficult for people who legitimately want to contribute and are contributing. Let's make it a little less hard. With this understanding, Lutheran advocacy supported the landmark 65 immigration law that ended the 4-decade-old quota system of admitting immigrants on the basis of their national origin and race. In place of that earlier policy that favored European nations, Lutheran advocacy supports the concept of one variable cap for immigrants that in principle gives residents of all nations equal opportunity to immigrate. You know, and this goes back to some troubling stuff in our history. Chinese immigration, for example. Tragically turning away Jewish people who were seeking sanctuary in World War II. This country has a very complicated history in being both welcoming and tragically and extremely unwelcoming. And I think this document is talking about let's be welcoming, let's be our best selves, let's listen to the better angels of our nature. Our advocacy will continue to insist that family reunification should be the primary objective of immigration laws. It will oppose efforts to reduce the percentage of people admitted for family reunification reasons, as well as costly financial requirements that prohibit immigrants with limited resources from being united with family members. It will also oppose policies and practices that actively recruit workers from developing countries to their detriment and to our country's benefit. So exploiting labor. On the one hand, not giving people in other nations a fair wage to the detriment of people who are here who do want to work for a fair wage. So that is not fair or just either. So we are going, the document says we highlight the following areas of concern where we think our country's laws can and should be improved. Facilitating citizenship. We welcome the desire of immigrants to become citizens. So as we talked about earlier, making the process so much less cumbersome and complicated. Benefits for lawful permanent residents. Most permanent residents are an integral part of our society who abide by the law, pay Social Security and taxes, and contribute to the economic and cultural life of their communities. In order to help assure their well-being, especially of their children, we support legislation that gives them access to the same benefits citizens receive. And note, here we are talking about lawful permanent residents. Newcomers without legal status. While most newcomers are legal permanent residents or naturalized citizens, a significant number of people, including many agricultural workers, lack legal documents. Many undocumented persons have been here for years. They live in fear of deportation. Those who become eligible to adjust their status are only allowed to do so by leaving the U.S. and then waiting years to re-enter. They often fear returning to a troubled land, and if they return, it would mean, for many, indefinite separation from their families in the U.S. The existence of a permanent subgroup of people who live without recourse to effective legal protection opens the doors for their massive abuse and exploitation and harms the common good. We urge leaders and citizens to seek feasible responses to the situation that offer flexible and humane ways for undocumented persons who have been in this country for a specified amount of time to be able to adjust their legal status. And we're almost through the document, and we'll stop for questions. We believe that our country has a responsibility to increase the number of refugees it admits. We also support fair and compassionate legislation solutions to the precarious plight of refugees whose present temporary legal status is threatened. Asylum. We advocate for a reliable, consistent, and sensitive implementation of the law governing asylum seekers. That's what survivors of torture works with people seeking asylum. Border with Mexico. We recognize, so I just want to highlight this, we recognize the right of all countries to control their borders and their duty to protect their citizens from the illegal entry of drugs and criminals. Of course. But we have serious doubts about the rightness and effectiveness of current policy to erect imposing barriers between the United States and Mexico. We support the search for alternatives to this policy that would more appropriately reflect the relationship of two friendly nations whose peoples and economies are increasingly interdependent. Whatever the policy, border enforcement should always respect the human dignity of persons attempting to cross the border. Again, I am in no way an expert in this area, but from what I have heard and learned, when we're talking about this rhetoric of illegal drugs pouring into our country, my understanding is that most of those actually come through legal ports of entry. It's a truck that goes through the border crossing and the drugs don't get detected. It is not people sneaking it across the desert in the middle of the night. Not that that doesn't happen, but a wall would not stop most of what comes through anyway, because it comes through where people are coming through anyhow, if that makes sense. Not saying, I mean, that is my understanding. Again, I would encourage all of you, if you go back and say, that can't be right, research it, come back to me. I want to present things that are true and accurate, but to my knowledge, majority of the illegal drugs, for example, come into this country through places that people are already coming through, that are already access points. So.
Or the tunnel in San Diego.
That they just discovered.
Yeah, yes, that happens. Not that that doesn't happen. I'm not saying it doesn't, but that's just not most of it. It does happen, but that's not most of it. Yeah.
And it's the same with trafficked people.
Yes, human trafficking, yes. Yeah, it mostly, it's the tragic when they find those trucks of people, and, oh gosh, just, yeah, same, from my understanding.
And ports.
It's the same, and ports, yeah, that, which, yeah, should there be good security at those places to keep that from happening? Of course, and I don't think anybody would disagree with, should we stop illegal drugs and human trafficking? Yes. Are there different ways to do it that might be more effective than a wall? I say yes. Some people disagree, I know that, but I think this document in the ELCA, and I would affirm, we do have the right to control the borders and protect citizens. That is what the government should do, protect our people. But there are better and worse ways to do that. There are more compassionate and more effective ways, and less so, I would say. The newcomers in our church from around the world remind us that all of us in the Church of Jesus Christ are sojourners, strangers, foreigners, aliens. For here we have no lasting city, but we are looking for the city that is to come. As we journey together through the time God has given us, may God give us the grace of a welcoming heart and an overflowing love for the new neighbors among us. Again, as the ELCA tends to do, this feels like a fairly straightforward call for compassion and justice, and not asking anybody to quote unquote break the law, but sometimes laws themselves are unjust, and it is the law serving the common good. Is the law just and fair and compassionate? And we are called as people of faith for millennia have done, to ask those questions and try and find reasonable solutions. Okay, there's a couple, good. Any other questions or comments about that before we move on to a couple of these other documents really quick? Yes?
I have a question.
Yes.
I don't know what a blood guilt is.
Oh, blood guilt is when you kill someone,
Oh.
and their family, because in that day and age, you kill my brother, I'm gonna kill you and your whole family.
Okay.
So in order to keep from being killed and their whole family, they would flee. So that, in that case, that person probably would fit criminal status. But yes, blood guilt is you have blood on your hands. You are not to spill human blood. And if you've done that, now to be fair, once that person, my understanding is, once you arrive in that city, there are repercussions. There should be a trial. It's not like you can just go somewhere and then get away with it. But you shelter them and then you seek reasonable justice. Yeah. So the goal is justice. Yes. Any other questions? Oh, here's that. I didn't make copies for everybody, but here's that flow chart I was talking about. This one's kind of small and hard to read, but this is from Amparo. If you look, you'll see that graphic under the resources, and you can look up kind of a circuitous way to try and gain legal status in the country. Okay. So then I thought really quick, there were a couple other relevant documents that we won't go to in any detail, but I thought we should talk about them because part of what spurred this whole class was at the last church-wide synod assembly when the ELCA declared themselves a sanctuary denomination, and people had questions. And I had questions because it was actually a very, from my understanding, spur-of-the-moment thing that happened. And interestingly, and I went back and looked this up, in 2017, I think it was the Oregon Synod, had actually presented, I don't know if it got to a memorial, but they wanted the ELCA to declare themselves a sanctuary denomination, and the church council said pass. But then they got to church-wide assembly, and the New York Synod reintroduced the memorial, and there was such overwhelming support from the floor that it passed, catching, frankly, some people in the church by surprise. This was a passionate response to what is happening in our world, a compassionate response that was not entirely expected by even the higher-ups of the ELCA, frankly. But I did find this document, a social policy resolution, which is also not a message or a social statement, but in 2009, it was adopted by the church council. So still 11 years ago. But that's for your perusal. We won't dive into it, but it's sort of an update, and it leans heavily on the social message. The ELCA has a long history of helping immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers settle in the U.S., supporting fair and generous immigration policies. Theological commitments. In '98, the ELCA adopted a message on immigration that reiterated long-standing Lutheran commitments to both newcomers and just laws that serve the common good. And then again, grounding these statements as is right and proper in our theological understandings and our faith, created in the image of God. Human beings are created in God's image as social beings whose dignity, worth, and value are conferred by God. We are created to live together with God and one another in love and freedom, reflecting or imaging God's perfect love and freedom. Therefore, this church seeks to oppose anything that disables or destroys a person's capacity to relate to God and others in this way. So, what is the ELCA calling for? A just government that serves the common good. God appoints and authorizes governments to preserve the created order and serve the common good, primarily through the exercise of judgment between right and wrong, good and bad. The ELCA further specifies that governments are to serve the global common good, for example, through fair trade policies or refugees assistance. Governing authorities are to seek justice, foster peace, protect people, and support their well-being. The church therefore acknowledges the rule of law and the role of government in facilitating orderly migration and integration, and in preventing migration that might be dangerous or harmful to host communities. So, it's not just anything goes. It's not just a free-for-all. Grace isn't about allowing evil or harm to take place. As Paul writes, I think in Romans, because grace abounds, should sin abound? Of course not. Of course not. But at that time, and remember this is 2009, they're saying there's a broken immigration system, so this has been a challenge for a long time. Because of overstaying their work, student or tourist visas, or crossing the border illegally, an estimated 12 million immigrants live in the United States without legal status. That's actually, as I understand it, gone down. In part because some people have returned, in part because some people have gained their legal status, in part because fewer people are currently coming into the country illegally. Pew Forum for 2018, it was 10.5 million, but it's hovering right around that number. Although laws prohibit employers from hiring unauthorized workers, many employers, for a variety of reasons, are not in compliance. So this speaks to justice for working people, all working people. People who don't have jobs because they're being undercut by those people who are being exploited with a very low wage and who can't complain about it because they don't have legal status. So it's destructive all around. The new security paradigm and enforcement only approaches. The September 11th terrorist attacks on the U.S. renewed the federal government's policy emphasis on national security, focusing particular attention on border control and interior enforcement. However, at the bottom of of this paragraph, the blurring of the distinction between anti-terrorism efforts, and which are good and we should do, obviously, and the prosecution of routine worksite immigration violations, both responsibilities of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, has resulted in false characterizations of unauthorized immigrants. It is so unjust to characterize an entire group of people by the bad actors in it. It is not true, it is not fair, it is not right, and that stands for any group of people in any circumstance. There are bad actors from all over the place, in all times and places, of all characteristics, tragically. So to take a few bad actors and blow them up into being representative of all of these people, whoever these people are, is